My talk today is going to be on the influence of listeners' experience, their age, and their country of residence or their culture on headphone sound quality preferences. The last couple of years we've been really focused on headphone research in our group, and the reason was obviously it's a growing category, lots of sales, but when we looked at the scientific literature, there hadn't been a lot of really rigorous work done in listening tests, trying to measure listeners' impressions of headphone sound quality, and then if you looked at the standards, there really hadn't been much work done. For us, we saw this as an opportunity to try to add a little more science to headphone sound quality. So we've presented 7 papers in the past 2 years. The first one focused on just trying to do a controlled listening test and looking at preliminary correlations. And then the second paper, we actually started to equalize headphones to different target responses. So we took 2 sets of headphones, we equalized them to diffuse field, different diffuse field interpretations, free field, and then we came up with some own targets of our own, which I'll talk a bit about. And what we found was basically that the current standards, the diffuse and free field responses and variants of those were not very well much liked or preferred to ones that we were coming up with. And then we wanted to do more research, but we kept coming up against this problem with it's really difficult to do a controlled comparison of different headphones and control variables like brand and the feel and the price and all those. So we came up with a virtual headphone methodology where we could listen to virtual versions of the headphones, and I'll talk a bit about that. That's the method that we used in this particular paper. And then the next paper, the fourth paper, we stepped back and we looked at what is the target response that's preferred, and instead of coming up with a set and having people rate them, let's actually give the listener control of the target function. So we first went into a room and did a very controlled experiment where people could adjust the target response of the speaker measured in the room. And we gave them a bass control and a treble control. And then we did the same thing with a headphone. We equalized it to the same in-room target, the baseline target, and then we had people adjust the bass and the treble of the headphone. And that led to the target that we used in this particular set of experiments. So we have a lot of data, both for the speaker as well as the headphone target, and they're actually not that different. There are slight differences, but it's encouraging that they're very similar. So that means if you make recordings for a speaker and you play them back through a headphone calibrated to this target, people will be pretty satisfied. And then the last few papers, we focused on whether the sound quality of a headphone really varies depending on what age you are, because a lot of the demographic buying headphones are quite young, and there was a question from our marketing people whether younger people have different preferences than older people. How many people think that might be the case? 2 people, okay. I wish I took this poll before I did the paper. We would have just moved. But unfortunately, marketing people are very opinionated, and we had to have some data to try to answer their questions. And then the most recent paper, Steve and I just presented, so I won't talk about that. We just presented it a few minutes ago. So the research motivation, there were no meaningful headphone standards as far on the target response. Our early experiments showed that headphones calibrated to diffuse and free field were less preferred to other options, and as I said, we came up with this preferred target response based on the in-room response of an accurate loudspeaker. When I say accurate, based on anechoic measurements, that's calibrated in a reference listening room. And but then we came to this question that if this is the basis for a new headphone standard, We really need to show proof that it would have wide acceptance amongst listeners from different age groups, listening experiences, and culture. So unlike most of the standards that exist, there's not a lot of data supporting that people, listeners from different countries, different demographics, actually like it. It's usually just a bunch of old men in a room deciding that this is what people are going to like. So these are the 4 headphones that we tested. We tested this Harman target curve, which is pretty well described in this paper that you can read. We also included the most expensive headphone Sennheiser makes. It's a $1,500. It's an open back dynamic headphone. It's very highly regarded, and it's an ideal headphone because it's open and it fits people really well, so you get a very consistent response. The other headphone that we included was an Audis LCD2, which if you read headphone enthusiast websites, it's really highly regarded. Audis really has a lot of followers. It happens to be a very expensive headphone. This model is $1,000. They now make models that are $2,000. And it's a magnetic planar headphone, so it's a different transduction principle than the Sennheiser. And then, of course, to answer questions about what youth like, and obviously this is, I think, the most popular headphone amongst youth in this price category, we included the Beats by Dre Studio Edition. So the question in this paper, I'm just going to go back to some previous papers where we looked at this target response so I can give you some background on why we selected this particular target response. And the way it was derived, we went into our reference room and we measured the in-room response of a loudspeaker of a system. And these were pretty accurate loudspeakers. They're JBL LSR 6332, so they're professional monitors. And at the listening position, we measured the response at the eardrum of 7 channels. And that became basically the basis for this target response. So if we equalize a headphone to match what we've measured in the room, the theory is people will like this because this is sort of what headphones or what recordings are monitored through and made to sound good. So we came up with 2 different targets. One had a little less bass and treble than the other. That was Harman Target 2. And then we had one that had a little more bass and treble. That was Target 1. We compared that to a diffuse field calibrated headphone based on the work of Mueller. And then we included as a hidden reference the Audis headphone without any EQ. And then we included a different version of the diffuse field by Moeller and Hammershoy, and then we included the free field calibrated headphone. So it was very clear from this set of results that the diffuse field calibrated headphones were less preferred, that the Audis headphone without an EQ was less preferred to the Harman targets, and least preferred was the free field calibrated. So we have quite a range, ranging from about 7 on a preference scale to down to about 1, based on different standards. So as I said, this is probably the most popular headphone in its price category. I think they have roughly 40% market share. And we included this in the test because it's a highly successful headphone. So obviously, we want to understand: is it because of the sound, or is it because of the marketing and the fashion accessory factor? And marketing was initially very convinced that we should just equalize our headphones to match Beats because that's what sells. And I strongly argue that if you could match their marketing, you would have no worries. But we had to have some data. So to remove marketing and visual factor and fashion from the from the listening experience, we had to come up with a virtual methodology. And we described this in an AES preprint. It was actually a conference paper a year ago in Finland. And what we did was we compared listener preferences of the actual headphones compared to the same headphones presented virtually. And in that way, you're completely removing all the visual marketing factors from the judgment of sound quality. And the way you do this, you take your target headphones, you measure them at the eardrum, and then you design a set of filters that basically emulates the magnitude response of the headphone. You then play those filters through a simulator headphone, and you can then, in real time, compare very quickly, instantaneously, between these different virtual headphones. And of course, you have to do loudness or level matching so that loudness is removed from the equation. And what we found, sorry, I'll go back. What we found was that we got about 86% correlation between the virtual test results and the actual results using the actual headphones. So pretty good correlations, and some of the discrepancies, I think, could be explained by leakage factors. So when people put on a headphone, depending on how it fits, you get different leakage in the bass, and that may not have been perfectly replicated in the virtual test. So this is the method we used for doing these listening tests. We virtualized all the headphones. Here I show the headphones. The dotted curves show the magnitude of the actual headphone. The solid curves show the response of the virtual headphone. So the dotted is the actual, the solid is the virtual, and we show the response based on an average measurements, 5 or 6 reseatings of the headphones for both left and right channels. So you can see there's pretty good agreement between the actual headphone and the virtual headphone, up to about 10 kilohertz, and then beyond that, we didn't try to aggressively equalize the headphone because there's a lot of measurement artifacts introduced to that. At that point, small positional changes, you'll get quite a different response above 10K. But you can see that there's significant differences in the shapes of these curves, and you might expect that there'd be subjective differences as well. So the question was, does the taste in headphone sound quality vary with age, experience, and culture? And so I did this was by no means a expensive expensive experiment where we did a very balanced sample and spent a lot of money. This was me traveling around the world on behalf of the AES, giving presentations last year. I was the president, so I got invited to give a lot of talks, and whatever country I was in, I would basically find some subjects and do some listening tests. So we were in Canada for a couple of days, and we did some tests at a local college, and the college recruited all the students, so that was really nice to have people do the work for you. We also did tests in Michigan as well as California using Harman listeners as well as naive students. So, and then I went to China in early November a year ago and did some experiments there at Harman using both trained and untrained listeners. And then a few weeks later, I was in Germany, and we did the same thing there. So here's basically a breakdown of the listeners. The number of listeners, the median age, the makeup of female, male, and we had each listener categorize themselves based on their experience. So we had, they had the option of saying, I have no experience, I have a little experience, a medium amount, or they could say if they had a lot of experience, they were considered trained. So there was by no means a balanced sample. It was primarily male, 86%. The median age, it ranged, the age ranged, I think, from 15 to in the 70s, but the overall median age was fairly young. It was about 29 years old. And we had a total of 238 listeners in this test. The three programs we used, obviously, we wanted to minimize the length of the test to about 20 minutes. So we chose three programs. The first one was Estelle with Kanye West, called American Boy. I'm sure everyone's familiar with that. It's a hip-hop piece with lots of bass, electronics, guitars, male and female vocal. The second piece was a more conventional, traditional rock pop program with Steely Dan, Two Against Nature. The track was Cousin Dupree, which I categorize as jazz pop with male vocal. And then finally we had a female pop vocal, and the artist was Dido. The track was Don't Believe in Love, and that's it has a lot of low bass, but it's, if you do a spectral analysis of it, it's fairly dense across the entire spectrum. To do these tests, we wrote a iPad application. So in this way, the test is automated. It's everything's randomized, and the results are automatically stored. So it's a fairly controlled way of doing a test, and it's also very efficient. So when I travel, I would carry 7 or 8 iPads and 8 sets of headphones, and I could get results of 50, 60 listeners in less than a day. I just had a lot of questions going through security, why I have 7 iPads and 7 headphones. So we did an analysis of variance to see what are the factors, what are the variables had a significant influence on the results, the preferences. So experience turned out to be a significant variable. The headphone itself was a significant variable. We found there was an interaction between headphone preference and listening experience. The program was also a variable, and then there's an interaction between the program and the headphone. So we'll look at these separately in the next few slides. So these are the mean headphone preference ratings for those 4 headphones based on 238 listeners and the 95% confidence intervals. So we can see there's a significant preference for headphone 1. It is moderately preferred over headphone 2, strongly preferred over headphone 3, and very strongly preferred over headphone 4. So there was one headphone that wasn't even in the race, headphone 4. Looking at the program now, you can see that with Estelle and Kanye West, on average, that program produced slightly higher ratings than the other 2 programs, but the effect here is really, really small. So it's really nothing to get too concerned about. The effects of the headphones were clearly the dominant factor here. If we look at interactions between the headphone preferences and the program, again, none of the programs significantly changed or altered the order of preference for these headphones. With the Dido selection, headphone 3 received slightly lower ratings, but really, again, there's nothing much here to talk about. In terms of listening experience, this is pretty consistent with all the tests we've done. The more experience you have, the lower you tend to rate things on the preference scale. And the less experience you have, you tend to be less discriminating, and overall you rate things higher on the scale. So again, this is not too surprising, and again, the effect is really small. So again, this clearly shows as you look across the categories, the more listening experience you have, the lower you tend to rate things. So this next slide shows the headphone preferences as a function of listening experience. And again, you can see that the more experience you have, on average, people tended to rate headphone 4 slightly lower. but regardless of your experience, you tended to prefer the same headphone. So that was somewhat reassuring that experience has little influence on headphone experience. So you can design a headphone, you can test it with experienced listeners that are trained and be pretty sure that it's going to be well accepted by a naive, untrained listener. So this next slide, I'm going to basically break down the different listening groups, and I've categorized them as a function of whether they're trained or untrained based on their self-assessment. So here are the results of the trained listeners from 4 different areas where we have Harman listeners. So these are the results of Harman listeners in Farmington Hills. These are listeners who primarily evaluate automotive audio, because that's where we do a lot of our development. The next set of data are from trained listeners in Northridge. And these are listeners where I'm located who they do a lot of loudspeaker evaluations as well as headphone evaluations and some automotive evaluations. But again, you can see their preferences are very similar. These are the results from listeners in Germany who've been trained. And again, these are mostly listeners who participate in automotive evaluations. And to my knowledge, don't do any consumer or professional or headphone evaluations. So again, these are people who clearly don't have a different cultural taste than the American listeners. And then finally, we have the listeners from China. And these people mostly participate in consumer audio evaluations, Bluetooth speakers and that sorts of things, as well as headphones. But again, you can looking at these 4 set of data, you can basically say that that they all had the same preferences for these headphones. And you could argue, well, that's evidence that maybe the training works. They've all been very well trained to prefer the same things, which is a nice thing, but perhaps it's a biased result. So the next set of data are basically from different groups of listeners who are all categorized as untrained. And again, you can see there's a lot more scatter in the data, but the overall trends are very similar. They tended to prefer HP headphone 1, headphone 2 is, depending on which group you look at, they either equally preferred it or preferred it less. Headphone 3 was rated 3rd, and clearly, regardless of where they're from, the untrained listeners all rated headphone 4 last. So the next thing I did, I looked at the effect of which country the test was conducted in to see whether that had an effect on their preference. And the ANOVA shows that the country was a factor and that there's an interaction between country and headphone. But let's have a closer look to see whether it was a large effect. So here are the mean preferences. This is averaged across all headphones as a function of country. And you can see that the Canadians overall gave the highest ratings, equal to the Chinese, and the Americans and the Germans tended to rate the headphones lower. And this could be related to training. I haven't closely looked at this, but there may have been more trained listeners in the U.S. than Canada. Or you could say that Canadians, in general, are just nicer people, and they rate things higher, and they're not as mean-spirited as the Americans. Canadian, yes. Of course, if you watch the recent junior hockey championships, the Canadians, when they're on a hockey rink, they're not very nice. So it's all about context. So here's the breakdown of the headphone preferences as a function of country. And again, you can see that regardless of country, the rank order of headphone preference was was unchanged as you move from country to country. The Canadians had the same preferences as the Chinese. The Germans, they liked headphone 2 relative to headphone 1 a little more than the other cultures, but overall the effect is much the same. So we don't need to design a headphone for Canadians and Americans and Chinese and Germans, it seems. What about age? Now this is important because people have suggested we need to design headphones differently for older people. And I'm not just talking about a hearing aid headphone. I'm just there's this notion that kids maybe prefer more bass and highs than older people. So, so here we have a breakdown of the different age categories, and as I said, they were by no means balanced. So for people over 55, they only represented 3% of the entire sample. But we have a fairly healthy sample below 25 years old. 37% of the sample was that age. 30% were between 25, 34, and 18% were between 35 and 44. Sorry, 13% were between 45 and 54. So, and if you do the repeated measures in ANOVA, we found that the category of the listener, the age category, was not a significant factor. And if you look at the interaction between headphone preference and age, we also found that that wasn't a significant factor. Yeah, so you can see that the headphone preferences are relatively consistent across these age categories, with the exception of age 55 and older, where there was really no preference between HP1 and headphone 2. And again, that was a very small sample. I think there's only 3 or 4 listeners maybe in that category. Now we'll just looking at the correlations between preference and the objective measurements. You can see that the headphone that had the slight boost in the bass, which is based on the in-room response of a loudspeaker adjusted to the preferred target, that's what these 238 listeners on average preferred. The headphone that had a flat bass response, so in other words, if the speaker was equalized to a flat in-room response in the bass, people prefer that less over headphone 1. Headphone 3, you can see it has a much different magnitude response above a kilohertz. Instead of having a peak, it's got a bit of a dip, and it's very ragged above that. That was preferred, strongly less preferred over headphone 1. And then if you look at the least preferred headphone, and this was consistent across age, culture, or experience, it doesn't have a bass boost below 100 hertz. And it's got a huge notch at 1K, and again, it has a very uneven response above that. So this is, if you looked at the measurements, you would say this is a very colored headphone, and that's in fact what listeners told us. So my conclusions, listeners generally prefer the same headphones regardless of their experience, listening experience, country of residence, or age. Listeners with less listening experience tended to give higher and less discriminating ratings, and this is consistent with previous studies we've done with loudspeakers. And then finally, the more preferred headphones, HP1, tended to have a measured response that was smoother, more extended in bandwidth, and had a bass lift to simulate an accurate loudspeaker calibrated in a listening room. And that's my talk. Thank you. Thanks for the feedback. Yeah.
So on your next to last slide, where you show the responses, and headphone 1 is preferred, and you mentioned that one has a bass lift. If I'm looking at that, it's also the only one
Mhm.
So how do you conclude that it was the base lift that was what was preferred as opposed to the overall fit to the target?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's just the base lift. I think it's a combination of the base lift, the right mid-range to treble balance, and the lack of, resonances, all those factors together, smoothness, all contributed, I believe, to the higher preference ratings. I mean, we'd obviously have to do a test where we manipulated those independently to really say what's the weighting that you can give to each of those variables. Yeah.
Yeah, also on headphone one, that's, if you go from 500 hertz on up, starting at the 2.7 kilohertz peak, that's very close to the DRP, to free field and diffuse field curves.
Yeah.
The others are not. The others are way off. So you're looking at 10 kilohertz, 10 dB differences there, or let's say at 8 kilohertz, and that's fairly significant.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, by the way, did you get marketing off your back, which is the purpose, I think, of what you were doing?
No.
By showing them that the Beat headphone had the lowest rating?
So you didn't hit your target?
Yeah, you missed it? They still bothering you?
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's always a, we're a big company, so, there's over 14,000 people, and it's really hard to make quick changes. So this research is, over 2 years, is slowly sinking in. And, it's, the nice thing is I have a lot of data from 238 people, and no one I know has this data. So people who are rational tend to hopefully see that this is a good starting point. No more questions. Wow. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for your attention.